Good morning, afternoon, evening, midnight to all of you. Welcome to the inaugural event in the Global Urban History Project's Dream Conversations on Cities and the Anthropocene. My name is Carl Nightingale, and I'm the coordinator of Guhp, as we called it, Guhp, and also a co-coordinator of this conversation with Debjani Bhattacharya and Toby Lincoln and Mark Williams and Sam Grinzel, who's not here yet. Okay, so just so you know, a little bit of background information. This is one of 4 such conversations that the Guhp board and members have been coordinating over the past few months, and that we envision will play out over the next few years as we grapple with questions of basically structuring questions of resuming in-person conferences and so on as they work themselves out alongside the pandemic. The other 3 conversations concern urban theory, empire, and cities and inequalities. I urge you to follow their public events because they are going to be cascading in number over the course of the spring, our spring, I should say, the next seasons of the first parts of 2022. And there's a lot of information on the the very ambitious intellectual goals of each of these at Guhp's website, which is globalurbanhistory.org. Also, just a quick appeal, since I have you here, to consider a holiday season donation to Guhp. It's very easy to do, and it's very appreciated. Basically, COVID has wrecked our finances, and we're relying heavily on volunteer labor to make these conversations work. We're in the midst of taking big steps that will ease the situation, but it'll ultimately fall on people who participate in these conversations to make them happen. So I think in some ways, I think it's fair to say that the intellectual ambition of this particular conversation on cities and Anthropocene is in some ways the largest. The presenters today have laid it out well for us. What does it mean to think of cities as functions of water, energy, earth, life, and air, to name the 5 sections of the paper we read on mutualistic cities? What does urban history look like when we consider cities as the great engines of transforming Earth, as the authors also ask us to think? What does urban history look like in an age not only of climate crisis, which is enormous enough, but at a point when several other enormous crises are either unfolding or looming in the near future? These are all crises associated with humanity's accelerating power on Earth. And that itself are part of a phenomenon that geologists want us to recognize by renaming our epoch of Earth history as the Anthropocene. One thing is clear to me: urban historians will have to engage in what Julia Adnay-Thomas has insisted are multidisciplinary as opposed to interdisciplinary conversations. Today, we'll hear from scholars who are engaged already in such conversations, amazing intellectual adventures on their own, including one involving the 700+ scholars at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who are working on the report on cities and the 1.5 centigrade atmospheric temperature rise, and the no less ambitious Anthropocene working group of the International Union of Geological Sciences, who have invited humanities scholars to bolster their case for renaming naming of the new epoch. Compared to that, I think urban historians have to say that we're just getting going. Guhp is very proud to be part of clarifying what's at stake. Most importantly, in this regard, is the fact that each of our conversations are connected to Guhp Emerging, which is our program to encourage work on each of the 4 topics among early career scholars in the field. This conversation currently matches 5 of these scholars with senior mentors, all of whom are on the screen, and we've already met as a seminar and one-on-one. Before Toby Lincoln introduces our main speakers, I just want to acknowledge them publicly. First of all, we have Catherine Oliver, whose project is entitled City, Chickens, and Galene Infrastructure, London's Urban Barnyard as an Anthropocene Global History. Her mentors are myself, Mark Williams, who will be speaking later on, and Gary Lee-Bice, who's with us today. The second scholar is Jinpeng Wang, who is project is entitled Technopolitics of Food Provisioning, Refrigerated Space in the Treaty Ports Cities in China. Her mentor is Toby Lincoln. Brian Spivey, whose project is called Resource Extraction-Based Cities in 20th and 21st Century China. His mentors are Li Ho in Shanghai and Mark. And then two others, Wangui Kimari, whose project is entitled Vernaculars of Geological Time in a Nairobi, quote, slum. And I'm overseeing that work. And then Vita Pivo, who's with us also, Soft Power, Hard Surface, How US Concrete Shaped Urban Infrastructure and Imperialism in Vietnam. And she's working with Nancy Kwok, who can't be with us today. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking, pass it over the torch to Toby, who will introduce our speakers. And they will then present for a little while, and then we can open it up for conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. Thank you very much indeed for everyone who has kind of given up their time today, and particularly our speakers. So I'm just going to kind of do a very brief introduction. One of the fascinating things about, one of the great things about this, I think, is that we're bringing together people from many different disciplines. And historians are very good at kind of being multidisciplinary within our own discipline. We often talk about kind of economics, politics, sociology, culture, but about things that happened in the past. What we're perhaps not particularly good at doing is kind of thinking about how what we talk about in the past applies to the present. So I think that hopefully this conversation will allow us to do that. So I think Minal Pathak is our first speaker. Minal has worked extensively on decarbonisation in India, and of course was one of the authors of the Ipcc report on cities and climate change. And so I think hopefully there'll be kind of Minal, hopefully you'll be able to talk a little bit about how we can implement policies and how discussions among historians, which are often very intellectual, can be translated into a space where we might have an influence on policy making in different countries. And then Julia Adeney-Thomas has written extensively about the Anthropocene and concepts of nature in Japan. And that I think is incredibly important in thinking about how, when we think about the Anthropocene, when we think about issues of sustainability, we have to look at how this has been reflected in other traditions around the world, and the historical trajectories that have got us here in the 21st century, to the 21st century. And then we have my colleagues, Mark Williams and Jan Zalasiewicz here at the University of Leicester, and I owe an enormous amount to them. They have been incredibly generous with their time over the years that I have known them, in sending me things to read and in making me kind of understand what the Anthropocene is. And they are incredibly good at explaining what is essentially an idea about geological stratigraphy and making it relevant to all sorts of other areas of intellectual life, but also our daily lives in general. And I think the Anthropocene is an incredibly powerful concept in bringing together lots of disparate ways of thinking about the earth and humanity's engagement with it, hopefully with a view to forcing us to reconfigure the way in which we think about our presence on this planet. So I'm going to stop talking in general terms, and I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker. And thank you very much indeed for everyone to come.
Shall I go? Yeah, thank you so much, Toby. As Toby said, and I'm based in a city called Ahmedabad in Western India, and we are about 7 million people, so it's the 7th largest city in India. It's huge and growing. As we speak, it's growing, just to put that into context. I don't have a history background, so I'm obviously the odd apple in this group. And I'm excited and honored to be here, but I'm also very nervous because I don't really have, I don't really know how my work can interest you or talking about it, but let's try. So what I will do is speak for about just 5 minutes maybe. So what I do, I work for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body. It's comprised of 192 UN governments. And so there's a whole bunch of scientists, like hundreds of scientists globally, who come together, look at studies published all over the world, and write an assessment. So every 6 years, there's an assessment. So this is the 6th cycle. But this cycle is of particular importance, as you would know. And just between the time I joined 5 years ago and now, the world has changed so much. Not just COVID, but everything else, right? So I met Mark Williams, at a talk in Kolkata before COVID, just before COVID in 2019. And we were on a panel together, and I was feeling the same way, that what do we have in common? Why are we put together? And we ended up having a long conversation at the airport, and we realized that we have the common interest. Like urban is just like among the top 5 transitions we need to save the world, so to say. And that's what Mark was doing as well. And so that's why here I am. Then I read a lot of your work, Julia and Jan and Toby, now that I know you, and I've read your papers. And so what I do is look at the present and then how it goes into the future. And you'll be surprised to know that we call it 60, 70 years long term. So we calculate emissions from transportation, from buildings, etc. of the present. And then we look at what urban scenarios look like in 2050 or 70. And they look really scary, right? And 5 years ago, there was something to talk about. So when Toby, you said policies, we were talking about energy efficiency, for example. But now we know that those little things are too little. We just need a huge change. So the change that we need in the future has never been seen before in human history, right? So while we have transformed at this scale, we need to either go back or find a new normal. And I don't know what that new normal is, but I was reading a colleague's paper on urban land use expand, and we are urbanizing at like really a rapid scale. And like I said, my city, and I just had a few slides that I wanted to show you actually, just so that I don't end up rambling. So this one's the Ipcc. This is what a typical Ipcc plenary looks like. And our report summaries are approved line by line. So that's the complicated report that some of you may have seen. And governments have a big say in what is approved and written. So it's a science policy consensus. But I was moved by this paper in Nature last year, which talked about how human influence on the earth in terms of just the human-made materials have crossed all living biomass. So it had been growing gradually, but now concrete, bricks, asphalt, the combination of all these human materials has crossed the weight of all biomass. So these guys put together a graphic, and this is what it looks like. So look at the amount of concrete you have. So the top gray bar is the concrete, and then you have bricks, you have aggregates, metals, asphalt, and other materials. And we continue to add as we go. So when we urbanize, we change the landscape in many ways. We clear forests, for example, which leads to emissions, right? We also consume materials to build, right? So that has emissions and energy, etc., associated with it. And then there is all this infrastructure is long-lived, right? It lives for like 80 years, 100 years. So what we are putting in now will lock us into a carbon-intensive world for the next few decades. So how do we look at this? You know, I mean, there's a big political discussion around phasing out coal and phasing down coal, etc. You may have heard, but when I mean, we talk about this day in and day out, but you'll be surprised at how normal, or people who are not researchers in this field are oblivious to this. So like this is the Earth system, And you can see the blue tabs going in, which is the emissions we are adding to the atmosphere. So the tab at the top is what human emissions are, and the tap at the left is the natural, and the tub is filling up, just an analogy, and it's filling up very fast. So in 2019, we emitted 59 gigatons of CO2, and we have 400 left. So we have just that much time, after which we will cross the 1.5 degree temperature rise threshold. So it is quite scary. And the red sink that you see at the bottom is all the engineering we might have to do to take it out. So if we miss the bus here, we are going to have to plant trees at a massive scale, or put towers that suck CO2, or seed oceans with, you know, you're geologists, some of you, so you know better than me what it will take. And this is my city in 1989. And yeah, just in 20 years, it's just sprawled. And you could say this about so many cities that you may be studying, especially the Chinese scholars, right? This is what a typical road in Ahmedabad looks like. 50 years ago, people were on cycles, and I'm not exaggerating. These were the traditional houses in the old city. And you can see Mark will talk about mutualistic cities, right? But I think some of our old practices were mutualistic. So the figure, the image at the bottom is of a bird feeder. And you see, this was all integrated into the urban fabric. So you had community living, you had natural materials, you had, I don't know, harmony, social equity. And then we lost all of it. And I don't know how. This is what the growing part of my city looks like. It's the same city. And there is some part which still looks like this, but a large part which looks like this. So just to say that I work with numbers, and I have like numbers on emissions, numbers on growth, numbers on biodiversity loss. Like, you know, 40% of the species in so many parts of the world will be lost. And yet these are just numbers. And how do we, I mean, we know that we cannot continue in the way we have. And so, I mean, we have solutions. So we have electric bicycles, like Toby was just talking about. We have solar panels. We have so many urban solutions. But I think the problem is that we just need them at a speed and scale that's not happening. So the challenge before us is how to rethink development and how to upscale the good stuff, so to say. So I'm going to actually stop here. And I hope I haven't gone on too long. And I will pass to Mark, and hope it was okay. But I'm happy to take any question that you may have that I may be able to answer.
I'm ready to share. I was just wondering whether there were questions for Minal first before I started.
Shall we take all of the speakers and then perhaps have a series of questions after we've heard from all the speakers and kind of open up for discussion? I think that would be the best way to do it.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. So I can go next then. Hello, my name's Mark. As Minal said, we met at a conference in Calcutta about 20 months ago now, just before the COVID outbreak. And we found we had a very strong, although we're from different disciplines, we had a very strong overlap in terms of our ideas about what was happening to the Earth system and how we might intervene to mitigate some of those impacts. I'm one of the two geologists here, Jan being the other geologist, maybe other geologists too, of course. I'm a geologist who spent most of my career looking at the deep time fossil record over hundreds of millions of years to look at how it's evolved, its various radiations and its various setbacks as a result of extinction. And when you look at the fossil record, you can also conceptualize cities within that as a new component of the biosphere, a new organism, if you like, a new type of organism which is evolving on the planet. ones which are having a profound impact, as Minal has already shown, on all components: air, earth, water, and life on this planet. So if I may also, I'd quite like to share a few slides with you. There'll be a bit of overlap with Minal, but I hope that's okay, because hopefully you can see my slides. Oops, gone too far. Can you see my slides? Okay, that's great. I wanted to start by saying that, you know, we are often confronted with visions of a spectacular technological future. This example of the Dyson sphere of planet Earth and its civilization extracting all of the energy of its local star to propel it into space. And these visions are fantastic. But the question we should always ask is, how on earth do we get there without destroying all of the resources around us and destroying the Earth system which sustains us? And it's a real problem because, as Manal has already said beautifully, cities have evolved to consume beyond what is available locally to them. And they produce massive waste materials, they don't recycle, and therefore they're damaging both their immediate surroundings and also the entire Earth system. And land use change often results in a decline in biodiversity associated with urbanization. And cities account for a colossal amount of consumption. Cities and urban areas account for a colossal amount of consumption within humanity as a whole, perhaps as much as 70% of consumption and 70% of the waste materials, carbon dioxide, for example, that we produce as a result of that. And of course, urban population is growing. It's now more than 50% of the human population for the first time a decade or so ago in our 300,000-year history as a species, and that's accelerating towards perhaps 68% of people living in cities by the middle to late part of the 21st century. So that's going to put an increasing demand on the Earth's resources. I wanted to use an example that we perhaps all relate to. We probably all know about Fritz Lang's film Metropolis. And Metropolis was, we were told, covered about 1 million acres. And of course, Metropolis was situated in the future. In fact, it was situated a few years beyond where we're living now. But Greater Tokyo already covers 3 times that area. So Greater Tokyo is already 3 metropolises, using a huge amount of water and cement and energy and other materials, as are all cities on planet Earth. We tried to conceptualize that in a manuscript that many of us here have actually contributed to, just to give you a sense of the scale of fresh water use on the planet, for example, and the amount of that that's potentially used in cities. And I wanted to add another figure as well. Very large cities, those with more than 750,000 people within them, move something like 184 cubic kilometers of water across the planet every year, from about 50% of the land surface. It's a colossal figure. It's I don't know whether you know Loch Ness in Scotland. It's purported to have a monster living within it, but that's 25 times the volume of Loch Ness moved into large cities by humans every year. So vast amounts of consumption. And really, the way that cities are consuming at present resembles very strongly a parasitic relationship with the rest of the Earth system. Jan and I, as paleontologists studying the biosphere over long time frames, can really recognize this in these terms. Cities, urban areas are organisms to lesser and greater degrees where they are on the planet in terms of the way in which they're utilizing the Earth's resources, taking and giving very, very little back. And of course, parasites often have a very, very detrimental impact on the host being the Earth system. So that's not really something that we want to cause. Minal knows much more about this than I do and has already explained this in much better detail than I can. But of course, as human primary energy consumption does continue to grow, the feedbacks are very clear. Ice sheets will melt, sea level will rise, and that will inundate vast areas of the planet, areas that are very populous and that will displace a lot of people. And cities, of course, will be strongly implicated in this because of their patterns of consumption. So as a result of this, a group of us really following discussions that Jan and I had with Peter Haff, the academic who is responsible for the idea of the technosphere, but also with Toby and the urban historians at Leicester, started to think about how we might be able to mitigate some of the impacts of the patterns of consumption on cities, and then very much following up with our very good synergy that we've developed with Julia Adeny-Thomas. We wrote a book with Jan and I. Julia also came very strongly into this, very much from the kind of humanities side also. So and Manal also. So many of us have kind of been thinking about this idea, and it's an idea that really goes beyond the idea of sustainable and smart cities, because in order for organisms, for ecosystems to function in a long time frame, they must be harmonious with the rest of the Earth system. You could use the analogy of a woodland system. For that woodland system to survive, it has to recycle the materials within its ecosystem to survive over long time frames. So it doesn't waste materials. It collects things from its environment. It collects materials like water, for example. It doesn't waste it. It's a very good system for conserving, recycling, and rejuvenating its entire kind of system. And this really needs to be the model for cities going forward. If cities are to survive long term for thousands of years, then they have to be modeled on natural ecosystems. So our ideas really are that we need to be thinking about cities in this context, that they have to co-evolve with their environment. And we can talk about how we kind of conceive this a little bit later, I guess, as part of the discussion. But we want cities that go far beyond this kind of vision that you can see in front of you, ones that will foster renewable use of energy resources, for example, and lots of other resources, promote biodiversity, clean water and air, and recycling. But importantly, we can only do that, we can only generate, we think, cities that will be sustainable in the long time if we make those cities equitable for all the people that are living within them as well. This is also a vision about joining scholars across disciplines, which is brilliant because Carl and Toby have now taken the mantle of this and are obviously developing this further, which is why we're having these conversations. It's about getting architects to talk to ecologists, for example, to design buildings which might be much more mutualistically sustainable within their environments. And actually, we should stop by defining mutualism here. We're talking about mutualism in a biological context, in the way in which organisms interact for mutual benefit. So insects pollinating plants, for example, that are major components in terms of preserving and nurturing ecosystems. Because we don't think that any technological fix or solution by itself will work alone, unless we, people within those societies, actually start to modify our behavior also. And Toby and Carl were talking about riding bicycles at the start. That's the kind of behavior that we do need to promote and get people away from driving cars, particularly, and ones that produce CO2, but also ones that are going to be predicated on battery technologies. And again, this is perhaps another point we could discuss, but cities that try to become mutualistic will be much more adaptable and resilient to change going forward, because they'll be able to utilize their local resources in a much more sustainable way. And that will be of paramount importance if some of our systems start to collapse as a result of the major perturbation that we're causing to the Earth system. So that's my bit. Sorry if I went on a bit too long. Apologies.
So, Toby, is it me or Jan?
Should we have you, Julia, and then Jan to close as another geologist? So otherwise, we'll have the two geologists kind of packed together in the middle.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. I am Julia Thomas, and I'm an intellectual historian, which doesn't mean that I'm particularly intellectual. It just means that I'm very interested in concepts that we think in, all the categories that we think in. And of course, this current framework of the Anthropocene has galvanized a great deal of work in the humanities and social sciences, some of it engaged with the science, and some of it resisting the science to the last stand. And so those people in the sciences who are explaining to us this new reality on our Earth. And I think everyone here probably feels that way. And when we do start thinking about this challenge that we face, we have turned, we meaning Mark Williams and Jan and Minal, following along, we've turned to this notion of mutualism. And Mark and Minal did a lovely job of laying out the problem. I'm going to turn to the politics of mutualism because I'm on a lot firmer ground on the human relations aspect of how we have a mutualistic city than on the technological aspects of how we have a mutualistic city. And indeed, it seems to me that there's a kind of separation between the technological questions that we need answers to, or at least, and the value questions that we need answers to. And it seems to me that in some ways, we've got a lot of the technological solutions if we would only implement them in terms of things like composting toilets, which Minal and Mark wrote about, Jan wrote about in a chapter in a book we're doing, building with materials like adobe or hay bales or wood. We know a great deal about how to do those things. The question is actually doing them. The values in communities that will support mutualistic biogeophysical cycles. And when I talk about values here, I'm not going to talk about religion or abstraction. What I'm really going to talk about is the value we place on how we distribute power within society, which is essentially a political question, and one that I'm sure Carl knows a great deal about in working on urban history. And this is absolutely key because how we distribute power will impact how we make decisions, not just about how to do things now, but about how to respond to what will be the drastic changes that we'll be facing in the next few years. About political values is that it's not just about how do we make decisions in one moment in time, but how do we create communities that as things change, as water dries up, as the old climate is changing and we need to foster a new kind of biodiversity, how do we make those decisions about how to respond resiliently in the ways that Mark Williams was talking about? And as I look across the literature on what we might call the politics of mutualism, there seem to be essentially three kinds. And I'm going to highlight in my brief comments that are sadly without any slides. I'm going to highlight in my comments, the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was a economist and indeed one of the first women to receive a Nobel Prize in economics. And she did truly extraordinary work. And she was very interested in communities making decisions in relationship to their environment. And when you look at her work and also the work of people like Danny Dorling or Dan O'Neill, what you find is that in order to make good decisions, in order to make any decisions, you're going to require trust in strong arming, one or the other. So what I'm interested in is the kinds of politics of mutualism that create environment. And I will argue that that trust really needs to be founded, if it's to be useful, on a kind of equality, greater economic equality. But that's not the way things are going these days. There are three kinds of politics of mutualism, as I mentioned. The first one has to do with individuals solving our problems. And the recent Ipcc Glasgow conference got a lot of those people showing up who know the answers to our problems, who can fix it for us. And they include people like Bill Gates, whose recent book, How to Avoid Climate Disaster, tells you in no uncertain terms that if we just give enough money to government money to Bill Gates's green, quote unquote, energy initiatives, we will all be saved. And indeed, he opens this book with an absolutely stunning overview of himself in relationship to the world. He is in a tiny plane, no doubt a private jet, flying over the darkness of Africa. And he looks down at the dark continent and he thinks about the little African children who are trying to read but can't because it's dark. I mean, anybody here will see how appallingly this draws on the tropes of imperialism and all sorts of things. Anyway, Bill Gates is thinking about the small African children, and his solution is that he will bring them light, and he will light up the whole continent, and all will be well. And of course, this is not a mutualistic vision, because he is thinking of the environmental challenges that we face solely in terms of energy production from transport and light. He's not even touching on cement. And what he's going to do in lighting up all of Africa is destroy a lot of biodiversity. The turtle dove at night, they cover 300 to 400 miles a night. But if it's not dark, they can't fly. And so turtle doves, along with so many other creatures, are part of the thinking that we need to bring into a mutualistic vision. It can't just be energy. It also has to be biodiversity and water and all the other things that Mark and Manal have mentioned. So this idea of a kind of mutualistic politics of the individual is simply impossible. I think once we get individuals making decisions, they're already not thinking collectively. They're thinking about their own interests. They're thinking about how to center their vision rather than negotiating a collective vision. Another way of doing this is less individualistic, but also top-down, which is to say that there are technological solutions that can be imposed. And there's a recent article by Manuel Arias Maldonado, who is also a contributor to the book. Manuel Arias Maldonado is interested in turning our problems into a technological problem. He's a political scientist, but he says the answers are to remove the nasty politics of values and the polarization around those values from this question and treat it simply as a technological problem that we can solve, telling people that they don't have to change their behavior, explaining to them that this really isn't going to threaten their way of life. And as a political strategy, I can understand in our very polarized moment that this at least might get us to make a few steps towards ratcheting down our carbon emissions or one aspect of the Anthropocene. But overall, it's a failure of vision for precisely the reasons that Manal mentioned. We need a huge change. We do need a change in overall behaviors. And we do need a change in our value systems, particularly the value systems that distribute the power-making decision. So the third kind of politics of mutualism, a true politics of mutualism, is neither individualistic nor technocratically top-down, but constituting trust in communities. And Elinor Ostrom's work does this by looking at small-scale communities that are capable of making collective decisions on, say, irrigation rights. And she is working in Asia. She looks at many examples, but perhaps the most telling one is in Mongolia, where with aerial photography, they look down on the grasslands at the borders of China, Russia, and Mongolia. And they see where three different political systems are impacting that landscape. In Russia, the answers are top down and the landscape is destroyed. In China, I think I'm getting this right, the answers are individual. People are having their own herds in their own land and the landscape is destroyed. In Mongolia, the decisions are still made collectively so that the common land is shared by everybody and that grassland is thriving. And that's the model that she suggests, that if you have a small group of people who have a problem, an environmental problem that is at the center of their concerns, everybody has a lot of buy-in, everybody has a lot of expertise on this, they know how to run domestic animals, and they have shared cultural values. If you can level the playing field in terms of making decisions, you're going to get decisions that benefit everybody and create greater biodiversity, be less impactful on the environment. And this is borne out in some ways, even at larger scale studies, where, for instance, Dan O'Neill collates information on more equal societies in relationship to the kinds of impacts they have on the environment. And the more equal a society is, the less it draws down on environmental bounty. So there seems to be lessons here about the way a mutualistic city would be governed politically. There has to be a lot of buy-in, a lot of activity around decision-making, a lot more time spent on those kinds of negotiations so that people will care about their environment and understand how important that local environment is to their well-being. But of course, there are problems. It's very difficult to scale this up to cities with 10 million people, for instance. It's very difficult, and this is of course a pressing problem, to bring in migrants who have different values, different ways of talking, perhaps even a different language, into that community decision and have that not breed suspicion and destroy the trust that's in that community. And the third problem, it seems to me, and the one that perhaps is overwhelming these days, is in order to create mutualism, we need a constant effort to work against the concentration of wealth. The concentration of wealth over and over again is correlated with disproportional use of natural resources. And I'm going to end my comments on a happier note, perhaps, than this talk would truly indicate, which is to say that a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with the United Nations Human Development report writers. They're in the process of writing the third of 3 reports on human development that are hearkening to the concept of the Anthropocene. And I came to this meeting not knowing what to expect. Unlike Minal, I don't usually move in the circles of the United Nations. I wasn't quite sure what this would be like. And I was stunned and delighted to hear these economists talking about the need for degrowth in the first world, the developed world. And that, I must admit, gave me heart. The idea that the first thing we need to put on the table is the real question of what those of us who live in the developed world actually need, so that everybody can have decency and a chance to live a decent life. So I'll end there. Apologies for no slides, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. There's some really interesting thoughts in that. And now we'll turn to Jan, our last speaker, for your thoughts. Thanks, Jan.
Yes, I think that, thank you. You know, all Toby, Minal, Julian, of course, Carl, for organizing this. I will simply respond by some very brief thoughts and maybe just questions, because I'm much more interested in hearing what will transpire out of this discussion than in you know, any observations that I might make. But I think one thing is with Minal laid out very clearly the process that she's been involved in for the last, you know, 5 or 6 years, I think she said, but it's been going on now for the best part of 3 decades, where increasingly, you know, the evidence has become clearer and being shouted ever more loudly that the Earth trajectory is changing, climate is changing, and yet the pattern of carbon emissions has not changed. You know, that is, you know, simply a fact. And indeed, the pattern of carbon emissions is, if anything, speeding up. So my question is anything now, are there any indications that things might change after the latest COP meeting? You know, or is it a simple, if you like, a decoupling of the whole enterprise of science and all of the different sciences that go into the Ipcc from, if you like, the real world, the world of agriculture and the economy and building cities and so forth. You know, that is, you know, I'm, you know, that's an ever larger question with me. With Mark, my question is, again, you know, the logic is, you know, impeccable, and I've discussed this with Mark, you know, many times. And my question is how, you know, one can see what is happening and the scale of growth of cities, you know, and of the things they are built of. The thought I have is now that will be taking place, or that will be evolving on an Earth that is now changing. And I have particularly in mind, as a geologist, we deal in sea level change. Many cities are built on or at, or even now a bit below sea level. And so they will be subject to what geologists call a marine transgression that will turn from low-lying land to shallow sea. And all of the resources that are within those cities, that whatever we do with carbon emissions, that now seems inevitable over this century. How can one re-engineer a city, you know, to deal with that? And the bits you can't re-engineer, how many of those resources can you take to use for whatever you have to build a little bit higher upslope? in that. So that is a, if you like, a technical question in that. And another, we have the emphasis on concrete, and of course, the amounts of concrete are staggering now, in excess of 1 kilo of concrete, per square meter of the earth, land, and sea. And the growth of that, as Minal showed again, is staggering. Half of that in the last 2 decades. To what extent can you replace that concrete by wood? One reads papers of the engineers inventing new ways of making wooden scrapers taller, stronger, which will presumably be able to sequester carbon at the same time as providing shelter for people. Why is that not happening? Is it a cultural question? Is it a technical question? Is it a financial question? To give the kind of geological consequences, that is the only ground that I feel at all comfortable on. And I think with the question for Julia is again, she partly answered that, of course, as she went on. In terms of the human dynamics of making this huge change, where is it happening? How is it happening? Are there examples? And Julia pointed to the example of Mongolia sitting between Russia and China, each with their own system, and of course, saying it's hard work to translate that up into cities. But are there, if you like, comparative cities in different parts of the world which can be seen as more or less Anthropocene compatible? That is, more or less capable of providing a secure life for many people for at least a number of decades, even if we don't think centuries or millennia. In that, what are the better, worst examples, and within that, how does that relate to all the other things we're saying? So that's, yes, thought-provoking hugely as ever, and those are just a few of the questions which I hope might be explored, as we move on, with this meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for acting as a kind of informal discussant there. That was quite useful. Why don't we have Minal, Mark, and Julia answer your questions, perhaps very briefly, because I think they're really good ones, and then we can throw this open to the assembled, to the floor, if you like, or the assembled boxes on my screen to ask their questions. And of course, our kind of emerging scholars, our young scholars, please feel free to ask questions which are quite close to your own work, as well as to respond to what some of our commentators have said. So should we go around in order? So Minal, and then Julia, and then Mark.
Thank you, and thank you, Jan, for the very, very difficult question. IPCC is a scientific body, not really the UN body that makes the political decisions. So thankfully I can dissociate from there. But largely I think the UN process cannot solve this problem. I mean, I know this is being recorded, so it's a bit scary to say that publicly, but questions of poverty, development, the UN can only do what the UN is doing. And I think the problem as big as climate change will not get solved by climate conferences annually. So that's the short answer. On our approvals, things get very tricky. For example, meat exporting countries don't like the language on dietary change. Countries which burn coal or rely on oil want to change sentences about fossil fuels phase out. So the context of nationalism, politics, capitalism is are big factors that we cannot ignore in such a conversation. And yet the good news is that decoupling has happened. I think the report that will be published in April, but I can give you the data that 24 countries have managed that decoupling from GDP of materials. But the problem is that the countries which are growing are offsetting that decoupling. So India and China, of course, rapidly growing. So it's a political question now. It's not a scientific question anymore, as Julia also said. that we have the solutions, but how do we get countries to agree? And my last point in this answer is also that it's not inclusive. Like at any of these UN decisions, how many historians, how many geologists are consulted for national policies on climate change? None, zero. In India, there's no consultation. And I think one of the young scholars, Noah Cole, or whoever, if she is on the call or he is on the call, they asked this question, is there a climate movement? No, there isn't. So the fundamental question is, how do we get that sensitization of urgency out there? But I think I have added more questions than answers.
Thank you, Minal. That you know, I found it very illuminating, and particularly one thing I found is again something which is very much more your terrain, Julia's, and certainly more than Mark than mine. Following the Glasgow COP, the extreme sensitivity over words in all these discussions. So I was taken aback that it was the first time that the word coal was mentioned and put into one of the, the very word of one of the central phenomena, substances that we're dealing with. The great difficulty that has in getting it that simply mentioned as something, to be thought about, not even decided about, something to be thought about. And that is, if you like, a part of the human condition, which to me is clearly interacting very, very strongly with the Earth system. What is it that we will agree on, even in words, even in symbolic terms, versus the enormous reality of all of that. So great. Much food for thought. Thank you.
So you're, oh, sorry, Minal, go on.
I wasn't going to come in. I will just leave it. Yeah, maybe you can go on, and if there are follow-up questions, yeah.
Okay, I'll come back in because Jan's question to me was about how do you change things in the context, for example, of cities which are coastal, and we know that projections for sea level rise over the coming couple of centuries mean that many of those coastal cities may well be inundated. And as Jan was talking about that, I was thinking about a country that I know very well, because my wife is from Indonesia, and we know Jakarta very well. And Jakarta is one of those cities where large areas are already potentially exposed to inundation from sea level rise. And of course, one of the suggestions to mitigate this is actually to move the capital to the island of Borneo, to Kalimantan, the part of that island that is Indonesia. That's a technocratic solution to a large problem that would almost certainly involve a huge amount of additional embedded energy and potentially a lot more damage to the Earth system. And so when Jan was talking, I was thinking about scale. Now, obviously, there is the technocratic solution whereby you go and build a city in the middle of the desert or on the coast of Kalimantan, for example, and potentially do a lot more damage to the Earth system. You may, in the local environment, make an active improvement for some people, but not for most people on the planet. So I want to turn that on its head and think about how we might do this from a bottom-up approach. And we've mooted some of these ideas, thinking about scale and starting with the individual household, and even the individual utility. Whereas Julia and Minal, I think, have already mentioned a lot of the technological solutions at that scale already exist, as long as we combine them with behavioral change. And one of the things we've looked at is water usage in cities, and certainly in cities in developed countries, about 20% of the city water actually gets flushed down a toilet. And if we were in a room, I challenge you all now to go to your bathrooms and just look to see how the bathroom is plumbed. I was looking at the analogy that Minal used for the Earth system of a bathroom, And I was thinking, how many bathrooms have the grey water from the sink plumbed into the toilet bowl so that that water can be recycled? It's a very simple thing that could potentially save a huge amount of water and a huge amount of energy, but we're not doing anything about it. It's not something that you hear as a topical discussion. Or how about not using water closets at all, but using closets that are much more founded on traditional techniques of recycling waste, for which there are very good technologies out there, and they've been out there for more than 150 years. That could save a huge amount of waste, but it would involve some behavior change from us, from those of us living in cities where we've been used to water closets, for example, and changing to cities that are now founded on closets which don't use water, but use recycling. And there are examples of where this has worked very well. There's one suburb in the city of Hamburg in Germany, Neu-Alamoer-Horst, where there has been an experimental suburb for about 3 decades now, where the toilets have all been predicated on this kind of recycling technology. And it works, and the people in the community are engaged, and the waste is recycled. In fact, it's recycled back into the land, so it's reflecting much more a kind of natural ecological system. The technology exists, but I'll have to throw this question on to others, because I don't have the expertise to answer how you enact the political and social structures that will enable people to develop these kind of solutions. So it's a behavioral and a technological solution, but it needs to start at the bottom up, and it needs to be facilitated by those at the top to allow it to happen. And that's disconnect is what is part of the big problem, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Minal and Jan, for your questions. Mark, the question you asked to me, which is a very important one, is where is this happening? Where are we getting cities that are more or less compatible with the Anthropocene, at least for a number of decades? The answer is, I don't know. That would really make an interesting study. There are, as Mark has mentioned, small efforts in small cities. For instance, Singapore recycles its water, whether that's entirely mutualistic or not, I don't think so, but they at least are making an effort in that direction. I think the answer is that this is only beginning to be a framework for urban spaces where we have a cyclical move of materials through the city. And rather than tackle Jan's very good question head on, which I've just explained I don't know the answer to anyway, I think I would like to think about what we're doing in our universities, because I have become very concerned with the problems that, as I see it, in the way we're training the next generation, and in fact, the very structure of the university, the way it looks physically. And one of the things I like to mention to very low-ranking university administrators, who are the only ones who'll talk to me anyway, is things like, why not turn Notre Dame's vast green lawns into biodiverse areas? And I know this is happening at some Oxford and Cambridge colleges. They're actually returning some of the land to meadow, trying to restore it. Certainly this would be seen as anathema on our campus. I can't imagine that happening. There's notions of recycling food waste from the university canteens, also drawing from organic produce in the surrounding rural areas. All of these things would be really helpful. They might even suggest to our students that when they go off and have homes of their own, that they actually don't need to have chemically based lawns. They could grow, might change their aesthetics a bit. But even more than that, it's the way we produce knowledge that is worrying to me. I teach a course on the Anthropocene and history, and I've just finished it. All the papers are coming in today. And some of my students have said to me that they're angry about the education they're getting, because the knowledge that they're getting is so siloed, and they understand that problems are systemic. And putting together what they're learning in science classes and in humanities classes and in social science classes is not something that's encouraged. It's in fact very difficult to do on even a logistical basis. If you're a science major, you've got long afternoons spent in labs, which precludes you from taking other classes. And that vision of how you think about problems is going to be presented to you in that narrow siloed way. And then humanities people are doing something completely different, and even the faculty are not talking to one another. So how do we begin to have essentially a mutualistic conversation on campuses, and more mutualistic campuses, where we actually ask really difficult questions, such as, do we need to fly sports teams all around the country at huge expense? We're teaching our students that glamour is associated with mobility, is associated with carbon emissions. And at Notre Dame, as some of you may know, we tend to be pretty sports heavy. And so it's not just varsity teams, it's everybody all the way down. And also, tragically, we need to think about this in terms of study abroad. Does every upper middle class American child need to spend 1-2 semesters abroad drinking in Spain, for instance, as opposed to actually getting rooted in the community in which they're living and learning the skills of how that support network on a local level enables their work? That would be a radical change. And boy, if you suggest that, you see people with smoke coming out of their ears. That's not on the table. So I would say, one way to approach this for those of us who are lucky enough to work in universities is to begin to try to model that as a way of thinking for our universities itself. So I'll end there. Thank you, Jan, for your questions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to open it up to the floor now. I have plenty of things I could say, but I think you probably will listen to me. Fair enough. So does anybody else have any questions or comments? We've had a couple in the chat. Don't be shy.
Can I ask Minal a question?
Can, Julia, yes.
Oh, thank you. Minal, thank you for your beautiful, lucid talk. I love hearing you speak. I feel the passion underneath all that science, and that is very moving. You mentioned at the end that 24 countries are decoupling their material drawdown from GDP growth. And I'm really interested in how that works and how that's measured, partly because you read, as you'll probably know, in other places that nobody has managed decoupling if you account for everything, not just CO2 emissions, but everything. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So this is based on data, actually, data on consumption-based emissions. And this does account for indirect footprint. So it's not just consumed within city boundaries, but based on accounting. So this includes a couple of countries in Western Europe, Bhutan, and I can't remember all the countries on the top of my head, but it is happening. Partly it's also because of stable GDP growth. So energy efficiency leads to decoupling in those countries. It can't happen in countries with a GDP growth like ours. Like if GDP is growing at 5 or 6%, there's inevitably going to be high material consumption. But this is happening in countries where population and GDP growth are happening at, well, not very high rates. Let me put it that way. So this is, we correlate the data on consumption of materials and GDP.
So that includes biodiversity and land use change? No, okay.
No, it doesn't include biodiversity. It's just consumption-based material. I wish we could, but I don't think we have methods as sophisticated to account for biodiversity.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions? Yes, Gurgley. Sorry if I've got your name wrong there, pronounced it wrong there.
Yeah, Gerd, it's thank you very much. I found the conversation fascinating. I just want to go to a question that came up in the chat, or like a topic that came up with the chat, which is really the question of urban and not urban, or countryside, and the mythical countryside that exists in so many of urban studies and urban histories. And so I find the mutualistic city concept very intriguing. I find the parasitic city idea maybe less appealing, not so much because I would think that cities are not behaving parasitically, but because it's humanity that behaves parasitically regardless of cities or not, or at least that is my impression. I don't quite see how the country or the rural or the not urban is in any less parasitic in its relationship to the earth ecosystems than is city, at least not in the European or American context that I'm more familiar with. And so I'm just really wondering how we should really think about this, and how much actually the urban is really in some ways an opportunity. Of course, it is much denser and much more wealthier and much more resource driven in many, many ways. It is also denser and therefore more capable, has some sort of municipal capacity, capability of government, and so on. So I can see much more opportunity to actually intervene, and that is indeed what we're seeing, in various efforts. If it was not for cities in the United States, there would be no action pretty much whatsoever at this point. And so I'm just wondering how really we should think about this. And I think this question of countryside and city came up here in the chat as well.
Okay, should we take the next question, and then we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll let people answer as they wish. So let's take Vita and then Wang Gui, and we'll have the 3 questions, and then any of the speakers can comment on the ones that they feel best qualified to talk to.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the conversation and the presentations, which are so enlightening. I posed a question in the chat, but I'd love to have a kind of deeper conversation about it. Sort of like, where is history in these conversations about future development? How do we think about addressing or fixing historical injustices as a kind of central part of developing into the future or thinking about future sustainability? And part of this question comes from this kind of broader conversation, between the sort of the Anthropocene but Plantationocene as well, and sort of the way in which one really privileges kind of history of capitalism, history of different types of violences, and what is the connection to science, and where can the Plantationocene sit in the Anthropocene? Big one, but yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on these relationships and dynamics. Thanks.
Okay, and we'll take one more question and then have some answers. You're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I hope you can hear me because my internet today is a bit spotty. So thank you all so much. And I learned so much. I just had some brief comments and then a question. So I really appreciate these discussions. I'm happy. I'm learning lots, and it's interesting for me because, I'm based in Kenya, and the Anthropocene is not widely theorized from here. I'm sure there are lots of examples, but it's not widely theorized from here. So it's interesting to me. I just wanted to say to Julia, sorry, that trust me, no one is listening to Bill Gates on the continent. Maybe I think we should take some comfort in that, and especially young people. And in Kenya, 75% of the population is young. So maybe there's comfort in that. I think for me, what I'm always looking for, because my research focuses on, or is based within communities that really are really gravely suffering lots of local and global structural violences. And so I'm always looking for ways to create analogies that are grounded. For example, right now it's freezing in Kenya, but it should be 26 degrees, you know, but I was considering wearing my Canadian winter coat today because it's really cold. And so I'm always looking for those grounded analogies. So when we are thinking about concrete, and I know Vita works on this and Minal talked about it a bit, just thinking about the communities where that have been forcefully evicted so that sand can be harvested to make concrete. So I'm always looking for those examples. And I just wanted to say that, but one question I have for you, and obviously it emerges from my bias, is that Africa is always being, and I'm sure you've all heard Prince Philip's, not Prince Philip's, but Prince, the other one, the older one, Prince Harry's brother. But he was talking, Prince William, recently he made a comment about how basically too many Africans or African overpopulation is jeopardizing the life of animals. But why I bring this up here is because that's people like Bill Gates fund programs here for family planning, which are quite contentious, etc. But why I bring this up is because thankfully, but also I'm interested in how population doesn't feature greatly in the discussions today on the Anthropocene, because I'm sure you understand the connection. People are always saying, oh, it's overpopulation, very Malthusian perspective. So I was just curious about how that fits in, whether it's mutualistic cities or, you know, yeah, that's my very long-winded preamble to my question. So thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions. One about kind of the agency of the city, and whether we can have kind of mutualism in the countryside, or whether we can have mutualism in the city, or whether the two kind of, and I think there's some stuff in the chat. We have a question about the extent to which we need change in our structures of capitalism, and the way in which colonialism has created some of the problems of the Anthropocene, and then a question about the relationship between the growth of the human population and its structures and the Anthropocene. So I'm going to throw this open to Minal, Mark, Jan, and Julia. And who wants to? Jan, do you want to take it first?
Could I just make one that was very, if it touches, I think, on all of them, but it's if like a specific answer to Vita's question on how does the Anthropocene relate to the Plantationocene and the Capitalocene and those other kind of synonyms. To my mind, and I think Mark would agree, and perhaps even Julia, they are completely complementary. They're tackling the same general phenomenon in different and mutually supportive ways, or at least that's the way they should be. The Anthropocene as a geological term is bluntly descriptive and really tries to go no further than that. It is a diagnosis expressed in geological, even worse, stratigraphic terms about changes that have happened and are still happening to the Earth system expressed as strata. It is simply descriptive. It's saying this is happening. We can measure it in this way, and this way. What it doesn't say at all, you know, is how is it happening? What are the drivers? What's pushing it? What can stop it? What can push it further along? What can make it change direction? And there is a very close comparison with the way one works in geology. You know, so one, let's say, would fix the stratigraphic boundary between the Cretaceous period and the Paleogene period by looking at the change in the rocks, in the fossils, which is very clear in the rocks. But that doesn't involve the idea of whether it's volcanoes, whether it's a meteorite. If it's a meteorite, as it's more likely, quite how does that take place? You know, is it through ocean acidification, you know, or climate change? What are the various feedbacks within the ecosystems within the biosphere that made the whole system topple over? But it's simply in geology assumed that once you define something like that, and it's a reality, one will then begin to try and think about what it really means. So to me, the Plantationocene is a potentially really productive way about thinking about how the physical measurable phenomena of the Anthropocene, have appeared and how they are still changing. So it should be a wonderfully amicable conversation. I think the problem has been is that there's been a tendency to try and jam them together and say they're the same thing. But no, it is two, I think, different and supportive perspectives, on that. So within that, for instance, when we mentioned again this, to me, it's the sand rustling for concrete. Again, this is clearly a big and increasing problem. The amount of sand needed for concrete is huge. It will get even huger as sea level rises and covers the resources needed for concrete, as well as covering the concrete structures. So to me, that is a question, it's part of the, the Plantationocene, while the geologists can only say, this is happening and it's making these kinds of strata, which hopefully is helpful, but it's by no means a complete answer. So that's just my initial knee-jerk response to those very good questions.
Toby, may I jump in here? Jan, I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it. I think that that it's very important. This is where the concept of multidisciplinary comes in. I think it's very important for people to understand the sort of questions that geostratigraphy answers versus the sort of questions that other disciplines answer, and then try to put these in conversation with one another. The question of what gave rise to the Anthropocene is, in historical terms, is, I don't suppose, ever going to be solved. Maybe Carl can correct me, but I don't know of any historical problem that is finally and absolutely solved, and everybody agrees. But of course, the question of what forces started the Anthropocene have gone way back into very, very deep history. We have the Pyrocene, for instance, that speaks of our pre-Homo sapiens mastering fire, and then all the way down the line, there are all these different ways of describing the moment at which human beings began to gather the tools to have impact on the Earth system. And yet that is the question of how we gathered those tools in order to overwhelm the Earth system in the middle of the 20th century. And that's going to be, I think, a continuing debate, and one that need not conflict, as Jan said, with the scientific understanding of the changes to our planet. I think they are in response to that, a different set of questions in response to this new reality. But Toby, if I may, can I also respond to Gergely's question, if I'm pronouncing it, on rural, the question on rural issues, if I might. I feel overwhelmed by cities, and I take Mark's point very seriously, that because the majority of people on this planet live in cities, we have to think about cities. But I'm from a small town, so I'm much more comfortable thinking about rural areas. They seem much more manageable. So I would say, first off, we're different kinds of cities. And that's very important to keep in mind. When I work on Japan, as I work on Japan, Tokyo is a very different city from Southside Chicago, which is where I live now. And ideas of social cooperation, public transportation, sanitation, all these issues are iterated differently in Tokyo than they are in Southside Chicago. We have a very different way of interacting here. Not all of it entirely conducive to public safety. So, there's first of all, they're very different kinds of cities. And obviously the solution to creating mutualism is going to be very different in cities. But I have enormous hope for what's going on in rural areas, partly because I'm working with a group in Appalachia, which is trying to create local economic resilience in that area through creating timber concerns that selectively harvest the best timber, thereby keeping forests intact, but using them, and organic farming, of course, but small industries that are coming in that mean that people know each other and buy from each other and understand their economic and social lives as deeply intertwined. And in some ways, that's really working in an extremely red part of the world. These people are, in the last election, voted over 80% for the Trump side of things. But they can understand what their neighbors are doing. And I have real hope there. The problem is that local community is so intermeshed in the global community. And so this timber concern, when the housing market disappeared in 2008-9 and the crash, was entirely undermined. People didn't mind paying a slight premium for better lumber, more beautiful lumber. All of a sudden, when it was 2 or 3 times what ordinary lumber cost, because ordinary lumber, there was a glut for that because housing stopped. Then that destroyed those rural mutualistic system functioning. And I think that we have to talk to some economists about how we think about local, vibrant, rural economies in relationship to city economies and also in relationship to the global economy. It's a really, really good question. I hope you have answers, and if you do, please send me the links in the chat.
Okay, Mark, did you want to step in?
I can add a little bit on the comments about is the countryside parasitic too, and also about population growth, because I think there are some linkages between the two. And just to iterate really what Julia's already said, so it's clear that some elements of the agricultural system are also highly parasitic in terms of their damage to the Earth system. I think there's no doubt to that. And of course, they're clearly very closely integrated with cities, because a lot of what is produced in the countryside then goes straight into cities as major sinks of consumption. Julia's already alluded to some examples of where people can interact in a much better way in the countryside. And of course, there are many examples of where people interact in a much more mutualistic way within cities too, in terms of with the natural world. But I was also thinking that, for 300,000 years as a species, before we generated the technology to overwhelm the Earth system, we actually interacted pretty much mutualistically with the rest of the Earth system. And there are many examples of people around the planet at present that still do that in a very beneficial way. I'm thinking of indigenous people in the Amazon, for example, where it's been demonstrated where they're empowered, that they are much better at looking after the biodiversity in the forest ecosystems. There are the indigenous communities in British Columbia, for example, that are much better in terms of interacting with fish stocks and the way in which they preserve those fish stocks across the generations, or the Marto people in Australia, for example, and the way in which demonstrably they're actually able, from their interaction with the environment around them, to increase the biodiversity of that setting. So, there are examples of things like forest gardening that we've probably been doing for thousands of years, which again is a very good way of interacting between, and that can be in cities and it can also be in the countryside. So I think, although I agree that much of agriculture is also parasitic, I think there are many good examples that we can learn from where it's not. There are the scaling issues again, of course, and that kind of brings us to population, because Wang Gui made the point about population growth, and of course population growth has doubled in my lifetime since the middle 1960s. But a more frightening statistic to me is at the same time that population growth has doubled, the per capita meat consumption for every human being on this planet has also doubled. And that is actually a much more frightening figure, because it's that change in behavior and it's that change in patterns of consumption, which is actually much more damaging to the Earth system in terms of the amount of land that then has to be converted to pastoral use, and the amount of woodland that has to be removed, for example, to support that. So it does also come back to this question about how we as humans behave and how we interact with the Earth system. And there are simple things that we can do, like changing our diet, which can have a massive impact on the world around us, for the benefit of the world around us. That was it from me.
Okay, thanks. Minal?
Yeah, I wanted to actually answer Vita's question. I think she's left, but she left a very important question on equity. And I mean, my short answer is no, we are not addressing equity. In fact, I think we are making cities worse off, making them more inequitable. And I give the example of heat, because I'm in a context where summer temperatures go to 44 degrees Celsius. And we did a study in urban slums. We went and measured temperatures inside the house and outside the house. And you will be surprised that the temperature inside the house was more in summer than outside, because of poor ventilation and tin roofs. And now we are going to have to resort to air conditioning. And the ownership is quite low, actually, just limited to the rich and well upper middle class, but it's going to increase phenomenally in the coming years, not just in India, but also in regions which could do without air conditioning. We are going to have just so much air conditioning. And so people without access to cooling is another kind of inequity. And then I wonder now, looking at Jan and Mark, that all the SRM that we are going to do, put reflectors to throw out light, and all the other technological solutions that we are looking at, how equitable are they? Are we even consulting anybody whether they work? And I was approached by a UK-based researcher recently who wants to come to Ahmedabad and install mirrors on roofs of houses as a solution to reflect, of course, light and heat to climate change. I'm like, hello, who's going to let you to do that? And he said, we have to do it because that looks like the only solution viable. And so I don't know if that is intergenerational and intergenerational equity, but I want to ask historians like Julia maybe, or Carl, if there is something called intra-epoch equity, and where we are asking the future, like really future epochs, whether like how would they have seen the change that's happening now? But I'll stop here.
If I could I jump in, Toby, on that? Because that's exactly a great segue to what I want to say. I mean, I think it's the ultimate question, and in some ways, Julia has already told us that that's where it feels to me like there's the biggest crossover between the conversations happening in geology, the conversations happening in climate science, and the conversations that are happening in for now, mostly in urban theory, but I think could become indigenized in urban history as well. First of all, if you read urban theory, and tomorrow we have our first seminar, the two big terms are capitalism and empire. So those two are the foundational debates. In fact, we have the huge debates between neo-Marxists who are focused on capitalism and post-colonials who are focused on empire. And those two things are deeply, obviously deeply connected to the urban in ways that I don't think we have fully understood. But those in turn, I mean, those are systems of immense power run by human beings, mostly in cities, and that rely on cities foundationally. Without cities, you don't have skyscrapers, you don't have corporate headquarters, you don't have capitalism, you don't have financial districts, and so on and so forth. Without cities, you don't have imperial capitals and all the massive amount of buildings that are required to run such a thing as an empire. So foundationally, cities are places where those forms of power are exerted and have been for. We've got Michael Smith here. He could tell us just how long. The relationship between cities and empires, or cities and just put a subset. Cities and authoritarian regimes have been. It's a massive it's a massive history that goes back to, possibly as early as 6,000 years ago. A lot of debate on that, just how connected cities were to states, let alone authoritarian ones that early back. But that's a whole interesting question, that where history and archaeology run up against each other. The other thing that I just wanted to say, it strikes me that there's one thing that focus on capitalism and empire, I would say states, nation states, because we've been talking about how important the competition between nation states is and all of this too. And that is that, really those things are all instruments of power. They're all instruments of power that are located in cities. And Anthropocene, the very term, is about human power. It's about human power over Earth as a whole, possibly over Earth and its relationship to its sun, at this point by our messing around with the atmosphere. So it strikes me that our conversation could head in a direction where we think about that. What is the relationship between cities and human power? And that ultimately gets us into yet another place that the urban rural, or the urban non-urban, I would say more generally, that those kinds of relationships are also relationships of power. And they're relationships of shifting power. Like, for example, it's very possible that in the United States we'll have a rural or small town uprising that will overturn the democratic institutions of the United States that are based in cities largely. So that's not, it's not a set in stone kind of thing, but I think overall cities have been the dominant space of human power. Lastly, I'll just say one more slightly more hopeful thing on that is that cities are also the main locus of democratic revolution and climate movement. So, for example, it's hard to imagine the kinds of protests that are going to be necessary to shift the kind of state policies and capitalist policies and imperial policies that will be required without imagining massive crowds in streets, a little bit like we had in 2014, and where we have had increasing numbers of protests. And it seems to me that urban protest is actually a foundational piece of the story that we must keep in our understandings of cities' histories, but also of the urban future. So I'll just stop there.
Julia?
Did I look like I wanted to jump in? Is that all over my face? Carl, thank you for that illuminating description of the importance of cities. One of the things I was quite taken by your intra-epic equity. I've never heard that phrase. Maybe Carl uses it someplace, but I certainly don't. I mean, we have talked about intergenerational fairness, but the idea of intra-epic equity is huge. And I think what that underscores is the enormity of the problem. Intergenerational sounds very intimate. It sounds like, it's been going on as it has been for 300,000 years now. And I like that because that speaks to, at least in my mind, to the difficulty of thinking about justice in this new world. And I'm sorry Vita had to leave us because I thought her question is a really important one. And she is interested, as historians have always been. I think Carl and Toby will agree with me here. I mean, we see history as, in many ways, a political practice because it shows that people live differently in the past and might be able to live, therefore, differently in the future, that it puts our present into a kind of under a kind of scrutiny where we look at relations of power and justice and say, do these have to be this way? So, history has always been attuned to these issues of injustice and justice. But when we talk about intra-epic equity. That really raises the stakes for us. And Minal has written in the chat that she just thought about this today. I mean, obviously we have to talk regularly, Minal, because this is so such a productive concept. And I think what this suggests is that we need, in some ways, to rethink our concept of justice. And let me explain what I mean by that. Historians have traditionally looked at the past and tried to fix historical injustice, as Vita said. And fixing historical injustices has been a really important calling. But what I see us facing today is that we have a decade, maybe two, in order to confront injustices on an order that we have never seen before on this planet. Whole swaths of this planet being made uninhabitable, so that we are going to get refugees, perhaps to the tune of billions of people. I mean, that is truly terrifying. Places where people can't grow crops, they can't live because it's too hot, they don't have fresh water, they're going to have to move. This is going to shake our political institutions to their foundations. And what I've been arguing, or argued in a recent paper, was that we need to shift then our sense of justice from looking at the past to looking at the future. How can we create systems that will protect as many people as possible from the dangers that are already baked into our system? And that's a very new question. And oftentimes it's the same people who suffered injustices in the past who are going to be suffering them in the future. This doesn't necessarily change the constituency of justice, but it says we don't have time right now to fix the injustices of the past because of the demands of what Minal has just called intra-epic equity, so that we really need to look to the immediate future to try to figure out how we can be more decent for the disasters that are coming our way. And I think that that's a real shift in our thinking, and I think it's one of the very productive ways in which engaging the concept of the Anthropocene changes the kinds of questions that we ask in history. So we've got to let go of the old questions in history, not that they weren't important, but we need to reframe them now to address this epochal change.
Thanks, Julia. I'm going to have to go and revisit my current grant application and rewrite it in that case. I would like to kind of pick up on that a little bit because, and this is actually kind of connected to my current research, which looks at how cities were reconstructed after World War II. And of course, what societies have done around the world is they've thought about the injustices of war, and they've gone through a process of societal kind of trauma and memory and commemoration, and it's nationalized. I mean, China and Japan is when we talk about the war, there's all sorts of interesting political discussions that happen. So societies are capable of thinking about large scale injustice and coming up with solutions on a national and an international level, but also on very personal levels and community levels to do that. I know that in Japan, there are museums across Japan that deal with very specific wartime issues, and people feel this very personally as well as feeling it very nationally. And that, I think, brings me back to something that I think is really important to this conversation is what is the purpose of history in this conversation? As historians, we talk about things in the past, and Julia, you're absolutely right. We need to start thinking about the future, but ultimately, we're discussing things in the past. So I think history has two key things, and one of them I think is best illustrated by a response that my colleague is coming up. So there's a project being run out of the National University of Singapore about heat, and my colleague Chris Courtney is writing a history of heat in Wuhan in China, and he gave this wonderful talk in which he you talk about how people dealt with heat in the 1950s and the 1960s. And what they did was they slept outside. So they went and they slept outside, and in the evening they might pour some water kind of underneath these kind of wooden beds, and then they'd go outside and then they get a good night's sleep. But that also created a sense of community within these cities as they were urbanizing. And so this is a very low technological solution to the heat island effect, which was obviously growing during the 1950s and 60s as the city was expanding. So that's a direct, and I know Michael in the chat earlier, you made the point about kind of learning from the way in which certain cities have perhaps been more resilient to climate shock. So I'm not sure whether we want to think about the city as a whole. And I'm not sure it makes sense to think about a place like Shanghai or Tokyo or Chicago as being resilient to the climate, but it does make sense, I think, to think about individual communities and individual structures of power on a much more local level being resilient to certain climate shocks. And we can look at that throughout history, find examples of mutualism on a smaller scale than the urban. I think Mark and I have discussed, I think, a lot whether we can see examples of an entirely mutualistic city in the past, and I can't think of one, but I can think of communities that have tried to be more mutualistic, and I can certainly think of imaginations of the city that are more mutualistic. I'm thinking of the wonderful book Ecotopia, which kind of imagines this kind of ruralized space in California, which was written in the 1970s, which I think is an amazing imagination of what a decentralized city might look like, very much taking its inspiration from Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement, I think. And then secondly, I think the history, how we look at history is always a conversation about what's happening now, okay? And then that actually influences the conversation going forward. And so we've been taught environmental history is now well established, but the history and the idea of the Anthropocene is inherently historical, but the idea of the urban Anthropocene is something that we are creating here. We are responsible for creating it. So if we can think about how we study the urban Anthropocene in the past and think about searching for ways in which we can do that, that will help us to influence the conversation going forward. Because history is always about this conversation between the past and the present. That's how history is rewritten to be more inclusive and to think about new questions. And so in reconceptualizing the past from the perspective of the Anthropocene, reconceptualizing the urban past from the perspective of the Anthropocene, incorporating it into what we write, into what we teach, into how we discuss things with our universities, how we get more meadows in our universities, something that I think we'd like to see it get Leicester as well. That's something I think that will help us to hopefully bring about the idea of the mutualistic city, because if people see it discussed in the past, then they can draw upon those examples. So it's up to us as historians in these conversations, I think, to kind of bring it to light in the same way that we've brought to light histories of women, histories of ethnic minorities, histories of all sorts of other groups in society, and those groups and those discussions have then produced real social change and real improvement for many of those people around the world. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we've got time, Carl, for perhaps just a last quick round of questions, or would you like to wrap it up?
Actually, I think we're getting so close to the 2-hour mark, and usually Zooms turn us all into pumpkins by 2 hours, I think. There was one other little item that we pledged to try to bring into these conversations, which is what should we do next in these conversations? Just to kind of get a little guidance to those of us who are going to be running them going forward, to Mark, Toby, I, and Devyani, who's not here with us, but will be taking a big role in that. And then plus to the various emerging scholars who'll be working in separate seminars sometimes, and then in public events as well. Does anybody have? I have a bunch of different thoughts, so I'll bring them to the conversation. But I'm feeling like there is something of a consensus that's saying a multidisciplinary approach requires us to listen to what geologists and climate scientists have told us today, which is a vast amount of really interesting stuff, to learn more about that. And then it also to go inside our own internal conversations that are happening in our own discipline, which are heavily focused on, I think, on questions of how we would integrate Anthropocene cities into the past, as Toby just said. What exactly do those? How exactly do those? Does that imperative intersect with concepts that we already have really heavily developed? And I'm thinking of questions of politics, of capital, of empire, of state, of urban, rural interactions, urban, non-urban interactions, and what can we bring back essentially to the multidisciplinary conversation by honoring the concepts that we have and turning them towards this goal that we have as in the conversation. That's kind of abstract, but I'm wondering if that feels like a consensus that we have developed over the course of the last 2 hours.
If I could, yeah, I think that's, if we're looking at practical ways of developing this, and again, I hark back to Julie's emphasis on the importance of teaching. And I think one thing that, we're developing conversation here. And one way of doing that within, if you like, a teaching setup might be, it's one of the few successful, more or less successful, teaching innovations I had at Leicester, which was to set up a geological field trip, not in the Alps, or on volcano on Tenerife, or somewhere exotic, but within the city of Leicester. So taking geology students, to discuss the geology of the fabric of the city and what it's built on, and also how it's built. And it's still working, still going. And it strikes me as if we're trying to bring students together from various disciplines, to discuss these things, then this kind of it combines all of the virtues of a field trip, which is, being relaxed and improvisatory and so on, together with the framework of what it is you're looking at. And it seems to me that, if we're trying to develop that, then actually doing it in practice, with students, with postdocs, with colleagues, that might be one way of doing it. One advantage is you can sit for a glass of beer every now and again, to relax, from the heavy discussions.
Yeah, not with my undergraduates though.
That's something that's interesting, because again, Mark will, if you're going, the place where we have the best possible, interaction with our undergraduates is always in the field. It's all, so lab work's okay, lectures, well, they sometimes stay awake, but in the field, and a city might be a place to try and nurture these kinds of ideas on that. But that's an interesting comment, Julia. So there's maybe some kind of difference there, which maybe need more than one beer to explore.
I think that's true. I just wanted to say that I appreciate in that context, Minal, you taking us into a tin roof house and telling us what it's like to be inside such a place when it's 40 degrees or more outside, that it's actually 45 or more inside. That kind of thing strikes me as extremely important, especially because I think, certainly the conversation about the Anthropocene, certainly the conversation about the urban planet, which I think is another related concept that we did not hit on, but which is sort of sits right smack at the intersection of global and urban history. So it's very important to Guhp. These questions, the main pushback on them is, are we looking at these solely from the point of view of Leicester or London, or are we willing to go to Wangwee's Nairobi or to Ahmedabad and into that shack, and are we willing to look back out that way? And I think that, so I want to kind of extend your idea of the field trip, and that in COVID and in a global community like where we see on the screen, with people in Morocco, in Taiwan, in Cairo on the screen. We should be quite aware of that, and Ahmedabad, not to mention that field trip is going to necessarily have to be a multiple city one.
Ideal. I mean, and the way we're discussing now, is something that would not have been possible 5 or 10 years ago.
Exactly.
The wonders of Zoom and so on. If that can then be directed, towards having these conversations, actually, in different cities, in different, not just cities, but rural places as well. That might be very immediate, very striking, very powerful.
I'm all for them. Salati, I need some right now. This has been a really, really interesting debut for the conversation, and understand that what we've opened up, I think I can just barely get a sense of how immense the potential pathways, intellectual pathways that we could take from here are. So we'll have to, I think there's probably no exactly perfect next step, but I think we're just going to have to keep on taking next steps, because the design of this conversation is one that does last over a long period where we're and many places, and so I hope that we can keep first of all, we've recorded this so other people will be able to join in it. I hope we can think about some interesting next steps that we can take that will bring more people into the conversation and expand it along many of the possible routes that it could take. I think that since we've gotten to 2 hours, that we should probably just begin our sign off. Is there anything anybody else wants to say before we go?
No, Carl, I think if Mark and Jan could talk to me, I think it would be really interesting to take the field trip to history students, and then perhaps we can start thinking about how to take that to other universities. I think that would be, I think our students would really enjoy it, and I think it would be a really good way to get students in different countries talking to each other. I think it would be eminently possible to have our students in conversation with each other about urban spaces, the history of urban spaces and the Anthropocene.
Yeah, and if there's a way of preserving any of that, even by cameras or anything like that, that the rest of us could also jump in on, I think that would be a great product that we could easily put into our video feed that we have. So those, I don't know, think about ways that this could work in COVID, in the COVID era, and in a that might help an international community of this size extent.
Super, that'd be great. Very happy to help. Yeah, I'm sure Mark and our colleague Sarah Gabbard, who now runs that course, I'm sure she'd be very, she's very alive to these questions. She'd be very happy to take part in that too.
Well, then I think it just falls to Toby and I, on behalf of Guhp, just to thank our amazing, this amazing panel of speakers. Goodness sakes, what a treat for all of us that you've been able to join us, that you've been willing to stick with us as we've worked through the kinks of setting up a whole complete new program as we also set up this particular event. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. It's very, very wonderful for all of us. And I think this has created a document that will serve us for a very long time as we continue these conversations. So thanks to Jan, to Julia, to Mark, and to Minal above all. And thanks to all of you who've joined us. We look forward to seeing how this rebounds further.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.